Hello. Welcome to the Unending History Podcast. I'm Armand, and I'm joined by Noah, Owen, and Max. This is the third episode of our Afghanistan series, and today we'll be focusing on Pashtunwali in rural Afghanistan. Now, when I first got the topic for this episode, I was under the somewhat mistaken impression that I would be focusing on purely cultural elements of Pashtunwali. And quickly, I realized that the essence of Pashtunwali, if it has an essence, is deeply bound in material and political concerns. I believe we've already mentioned it a few times before, but Pashtunwali is something that translates more or less to the Pashtun way. And Pashtunwali is best described as a series of, or a set of tools for dispute resolution, adjudication, etc., without state intervention, without state power, and is typically considered to be restorative in its justice rather than based on retribution. So instead of punishing people, it focuses on making things right or making the victim whole. And when I first approached this topic, I thought we'd be focusing on how Pashtunwali is rooted in cultural aspects, but clearly the material factors on the ground in Afghanistan play a much bigger part. Now, why are we talking about Pashtunwali? Well, Pashtunwali has been the basis for stability in Afghan society so long as there has been the absence of a state, which is pretty long, or at least the absence of effective state power. And furthermore, whenever political entities or social groups try to infringe on the autonomy of rural Afghans, who constitute somewhere around 3/4 of the Afghan population, it usually ends badly. And the understanding of how to work with Pashtunwali and the autonomy of rural Afghans usually makes or breaks an administration or a regime in Afghanistan. And that is what is widely known to have contributed to the quick demise of the Taliban in 2001, due to the fact that the Taliban introduced many foreign concepts and jurisprudential standards that were not usual in Afghanistan and went against Pashtunwali, that violated the autonomy of local groups and ultimately earned a lot of disfavor. Many Afghans in rural communities did not like their autonomy being infringed upon. And naturally, this is what also led to the eventual severe unpopularity of the United States and the Islamic Republic, because the institutions, which were often placed above Pashtunwali and jirgas, which is the word for assemblies, the fact that state institutions, which were corrupt, were often placed over jirgas, or local autonomy, basically, earned a lot of enmity against the United States and the Islamic Republic, and eventually led to the rapid return of the Taliban. Pashtunwali and the autonomy of rural people in Afghanistan both have a very important role in peace and the creation of stable states, but how it factors into stability and what role it could play in a peaceful, stable Afghanistan is something that is more debatable. So to open it up, I like to start by asking you all about why well, you know what, let's start with the differences between urban and rural Afghanistan under US occupation and under the Islamic Republic. To begin to understand how rural Afghanistan was alienated by the US-backed regime, we have to understand the differences between urban and rural Afghanistan. So why did the US prioritize development in urban areas over rural ones in the beginning, but really throughout much of the US presence in Afghanistan? And how did that affect things going forward?
I think there's a couple different reasons. I mean, I think one reason is because it's kind of a natural that they're kind of just picking up where others have left off, like the U.S. did with so many previous regimes in Afghanistan that they were really just retrying some of the same ideas over that hadn't worked. So I think the government which the Soviet Union was propping up, or or governments before the communist takeover, could only focus on urban areas. Rural areas were too remote, especially the Pashtun regions. There isn't existing infrastructure, and there's under Pashtunwali just a long tradition of local autonomy that's incredibly hard to break into. I think pretty quickly the US government realized, oh, well, we can really affect change, more clearly and directly in places like Kandahar or Kabul, but trying to do that out in the countryside, with the exception of bombing or invading or breaking into people's houses, is going to be pretty remote and difficult to do. And it's not just, and I would also say it's not just the United States that was doing that or other coalition members. It was also the government of Afghanistan itself that pretty quickly stopped trying to effectively administer rural regions.
Yeah, and if it wasn't obvious already, I think there are a couple things that we should also say going forward with this issue, which is, one, it's unfair to the U.S. efforts and Kabul-based efforts to assume that rural and urban development are equal in their feasibility in Afghanistan, naturally, right? Development in rural areas is not going to be easy, especially with the fact that something like 3/4 of all roads in Afghanistan at this time were unpaved and still are unpaved, and that such infrastructure efforts are really difficult. We can fault them for not trying to go forward earlier, especially when the insurgency was extremely weak and such infrastructure projects would have less security issues.
Yeah,
Than
definitely
say
when
2011.
right. Yeah, definitely
Um,
in 2002 through to 2006 or 7, the Taliban had really been collapsed, but there were still a lot of local militias. There was still there was so much organizing trying to go on, I think, right? That a lot of the efforts just got put into trying to create any sort of state at all. And the state institutions in rural areas, I think, I don't think it's unique to Afghanistan, always get left behind. That your best, most educated people are going to be concentrated in cities. And when you're talking about Afghanistan, you're talking about a largely illiterate population already. So you're trying to establish, whether you're trying to establish a police office or a hospital or a court or just a sort of administrative center or a post office for mail or anything like that, you need literate people, or at least it helps a lot to have literate people, and they, the vast majority of rural Pashtuns are not literate.
yeah, and on that subject, on that note, literacy would play a huge role in would prove a huge obstacle in the creation of state institutions like a police force. Where, like, how are we going to write a police report if you can't write?
Right. Or just read the laws at all,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Exactly.
Like know what it means to enforce, and how do the people who may have be having the laws enforced against them supposed to know what those written laws are? They're not the traditional laws. They're going to prefer, the laws that are oral traditions that they already know, that they've always worked with. So why would why would we follow the codified statutes if we've got our own way of doing things already? And it works for us, or at least we kind of feel like it works.
Yeah, and more than just working, for many rural Afghans, that is justice. And
Right.
the notion of state justice is almost an oxymoron.
Right.
A lot of times,
How does putting somebody in jail get my goat or, my
yeah,
house back? Right.
it's not it's not helping the situation. It's just punishing one guy more, in an act that, if anything, could only engender more retribution, if anything. And it's just bizarre to many. It's actually quite interesting to read the instruction manual on Pashtunwali for U.S. troops, again called Operational Pashtunwali, which you can Google. But it's interesting to see how retributive or retribution-based justice that is practiced in the West or counterinsurgency measures that U.S. troops have to carry out is often framed as revenge or a form of Pashtunwali dispute resolution. Specifically, when someone has to be detained, it's advised that the officer or soldier on the ground frame it as an exile, which is a practice that is in line with Pashtunwali. And it's something that actually is seen to reduce the possibility of retribution and, rather, revenge. But the notion of detaining someone as punishment is utterly foreign. And naturally, we should be asking ourselves, how much does the state need to reach its tentacles into the countryside, right? That's obviously one of the central questions here. Even the pamphlet given to the U.S. troops, as interested as the U.S. military is in detaining potential combatants, it's recommended, sometimes letting local people resolve their own disputes ends up with less combatants than if you detained one combatant.
Yeah, I think one thing that the military was trying to get its troops to understand, the U.S. military, I mean, is that in effect, all Americans are part of one group, right? The Pashtunwali is a very communal
Yeah,
organizing
it's seen
force.
as part of one group.
Right, it's not just about some individual whose rights have been infringed on by another individual. It's we as a group, right, as a tribe or a village, however it's going to be particularly constructed, have been dishonored in some way. We have been that wrong has been done against us. So when one soldier or one platoon goes ahead and does something that they think is, enacting justice, if the local people don't see that, they're going to enact their own justice, maybe on those troops or maybe on anybody in that, in the American tribe, right?
Yeah, the Americani tribe.
Right, that the action of one soldier is the action of all soldiers, which is a sort of nice message if American soldiers had maybe actually felt that way more consistently. But
yeah, maybe it would have been smarter to go in having pre-established tribes, right? One for the Marines and one for the Special Forces, whatever. So that way, not everyone would be attacked.
Right, the American military isn't always great at disciplining its own troops.
No, and another difficulty, of course, is the fact that tours of duty for the average Marine are about 15 months, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, they're pretty short.
Learning those lessons, learning an extremely different and nuanced culture, where even if you spent in the wrong direction, that can engender vengeance against you. Learning those lessons takes a long time, and by the time that you leave, the guys replacing you are green and have no idea what's going on. So that becomes a really big problem. And didn't earn any favor. It often doesn't earn American troops any favor when they come in brash, taking no nonsense, and finding out that the tough guy approach earns them IEDs.
Or even if they're well intentioned, right, and they see something going on and they start talking to the women, right, like and want to hear something that's very reasonable, right. From an American perspective to do is like, well, let's hear, let's make sure that everybody's being heard, but no, you don't go into somebody's house and start talking to their women in Pashtun areas, right? That's very, very frowned upon. And that's another element that the state was having to deal with, right? That, that maybe is a little easier for the Taliban than it would be for sort of liberal democracy, is that the Pashtunwali generally kind of sees women as either tools to be used in a negotiation or as like objects of honor, right? That you're supposed to protect, that you, a man, right, are supposed to protect the honor of. Women can't really proactively defend their own honor, right? They're just not supposed to put it at risk. One interesting point, one really interesting point that we read about is that women can't enhance their family's honor either. Right? So, like, it doesn't matter, you can only lose honor as a woman. You don't, like, go and make things better for the family like a man can. It's it really is extremely patriarchal. Extremely,
yeah. And in Pashto, there is no one word that translates to honor as this all-encompassing concept that we have in English. Most of the use of the word honor translates in Pashto to nang, Nang, and that concept is male centric, right? It's nang is the thing that a man has to protect. It's how he protects his way of life, his women, his family, his courage, demonstrating courage, etc. And that's really fundamental. And it's true for a lot of democratic or horizontal, I should say, societies, especially in mountainous regions, where honor is really important because it's all you have to go on as an individual, as a person in a horizontal society. I want to say individual. I don't mean in the Western sense, right? I mean as one person among many people who have equivalent power. But yeah, that concept of honor is really important. And whenever Americans tread on it, they're treading to an American to be like the concept of tyranny, right? Or even worse than tyranny. It's something that glues society together because it's all you honor is all you have in terms of social capital, as it were.
Right, and your reputation is going to be known. You know, like everybody in your area, because it's knows who you are, or at least can quickly identify what group you're in.
Yeah. And if you have no honor, then good luck getting married, right?
Right.
Or good luck getting a business, right? So yeah, that was one thing that's really critical to a lot of people. So with that understanding of Pashtunwali under our belts, I think it's time to move on to some of the more complex issues at play here. So clearly, local autonomy is incredibly important in rural Afghan society, something that constitutes most of the country, that is, rural individuals. How did the institutions set down by the Islamic Republic with US backing, how did that affect the political landscape of rural Afghanistan? And was that a doomed cause, trying to introduce state institutions into rural areas?
I think I'm somewhat skeptical that it could ever have succeeded, at least with how rural Afghani culture is currently constituted. That like Pashtunwali as a power structure, like as a legal structure, is very antithetical to a state, kind of fundamentally. And I think that that tension, if you introduce like state power into areas where there's Pashtunwali, like you're going to run into this issue where, you know, you're relying on largely trust to, you know, you have to believe, people have to believe in the system in order to really engage with it effectively. You can't just coerce people into, you know, state legal structures as much as we tried. You know, so I think like because it was always structured as like the state needs to compete against Pashtunwali. Like, there's not really an attempt to co-opt it into state structures or like make it a natural part of how the Afghani legal system works. You're just kind of like walking into a wall. Like,
but what do you think? I mean, do you think that there were things that could be done that, you know, okay, we're not going to be able to erect a fully functioning state in a decade, but you know, if we had spent a decade really focusing on schools, let's say, like or really or finding more effective ways to educate people in rural areas and to secure their access to larger markets, do you think that that would have had an impact? Or do you think that the sort of cultural, I'm not going to say inertia, but the cultural makeup of Pashtun areas is so entrenched in an anti-state attitude that it was always going to fail. It doesn't matter if you can get the kids reading, or even efforts to try to get people to read. You know, even if we had redoubled our efforts, it still wouldn't have worked.
I think even if we had like redoubled our efforts, it still wouldn't have worked, or at least not in the way that we imagine it would have. Like, I think if we had really focused on building schools, you would have run into this issue where now the youth is like deeply alienated from their family and their parents because they now belong to a different culture, in a sense. Like, they can read, they can engage with the world in a different way than their parents can. And I think that would lead to, one, kind of a brain drain in the rural areas where, okay, you're educated, but you can't do anything with your education in rural Afghanistan. So you move to the city or you leave Afghanistan.
I mean, I think that's already an issue anyway, right? That,
and it is, but like, right. No, I think it would redouble that. and it would just breed resentment among older Pashtun people.
Well, you can try to teach them too.
You can, but
I mean,
do they want to learn? Like, kind of the advantage of like kids is that they don't get to choose.
Right. Well,
Where adults can.
But you do have to convince the parents that to get their children an education. And my guess, although I can't be certain of this, my guess would be when they traditionally think of education, they're going to think of Islamic education, right? Like you learn to read the Quran. But
no,
I mean,
think I can't imagine convincing parents without lying to them, in a sense.
Yeah. Well,
Or,
right. We don't want to
promise these results that, like, you know, if your kid is educated, then your family will be better off, and like there'll be more, you know, goodness in the area. And then I don't know if that's true, or if that would actually be the result.
So you guys have touched on the issue of education as one of the major arms of the state. I'd like to offer you guys maybe a broader question about how the state operates and can operate in Afghanistan that might give us a little more perspective, hopefully. And I'm wondering if maybe, Owen, you'll have some insight on this. I doubt you all would object to the notion that Afghans, in some way, rural and urban, all value the state, the idea of an Afghan state. I think that's been pretty consistent throughout Afghan history. In what way, though? Because clearly, many Afghans have expressed interest in having a central government. As much as Afghanistan broke down after fighting the British, and especially after fighting the Soviets, they never turned into Yugoslavia's. They never turned into a Balkan situation, right? With Tajiks in one state and Pashtuns in another, etc. Clearly, there's been a lot of interest in a central state. But what is it that makes all Afghans attracted to it? Is it education? Is it security? What is it?
I guess, is there broad interest in a central state in Afghanistan? I've always perceived it as like there's a historical interest in Afghani autonomy and resistance to foreign states, but not necessarily for a state, like a centralized state.
And maybe we have a little bias, or rather we have a very particular meaning when we use the term state, right? I think that for a lot of people in the West, states have absolute sovereignty over all of their territory. I think it's a very kind of Westphalian kind of notion, you know. And I think that a lot of regimes in Afghanistan throughout its history have exercised selective or porous sovereignty and power over the land, where there's certain places that they just don't touch, certain places where they have partial control, and certain places where they have total control.
Right. I mean, I don't think they chose that particularly, but I think that was sort of, they recognized the situation.
They chose it in as much as any political decision is a complete, decision. But I think that it's remarkable that as much as Afghanistan has been pummeled in the past century, really in the past, in all of its history, I mean, with the Mongol invasions and everything, that a unifying political entity has been often seen as favorable.
That is an interesting question. I mean, why didn't after the pullout of the Soviet army, like why, to the extent that it did remain a country, which, it was a country without a state, why didn't like Tajiks try to just leave, right?
And that's a good question.
That's a good question. I don't know. I think that's probably beyond the scope of what we can talk about here, but
maybe.
Well, yeah,
or are they like the Gauls, where like there is a Gallic identity, but outside of Roman invasion, like they're not a unified.
But I mean, I don't even think they're that. I wonder if, because I think the problem with that analogy becomes like they're not even that, right? Like they're not just speaking different languages, but
they're different cultures.
They're different ethnicities, they're different cultures. They don't think of themselves as the same. They just kind of recognize, I guess, a certain geographic unity, because maybe, the Tajiks were like, well, we don't want to be independent because that would put us under the purview of the Soviets, right? But now, in 2022, there's a Tajikistan right there, right? Like, I don't know. Like, nobody talks about like a Tajik independence movement. I kind of wonder like if the reason they didn't balkanize is because there isn't enough educated people to have that sort of sense of nationalism. I don't know. That like
Well,
that
one
idea of like a
thing,
national state entity just doesn't matter to Afghans. Right. That's not important.
that is true, I think. First of all, in Afghanistan, even though ethnic groups do like to affiliate with their own groups, more or less, ultimately family is more important. And familial ties and clans and tribes are more important than ethnic identities. Secondly, Afghanistan has never really been conquered by European powers. It was never really colonized. Britain exerted some control over it, but never fully. And Afghans still think of themselves as an unconquered people, maybe with the exception of the Mongols. And I think that from the book I read on called Afghanistan: A Political and Social History by Thomas Barfield, he talks about how Tajiks in Afghanistan see themselves as really better than Tajiks in Tajikistan, because the Tajikistanis were controlled by the Russians, and there was this tendency in during the Soviet Union to want to ask the Russians first before they did anything, whereas the Tajiks just what they want in Afghanistan. Right. And thirdly, Afghans have been forged in the crucible of national defense against the Soviets, the crucible of jihad. All of them fought together against this invader that was threatening Islamic society as they saw it. And these are all factors that contribute to this enduring Afghan identity. But nonetheless, there are also I think there are material advantages to having a central Afghan state. First of all, nationalism a la, Serbia or Bosnia or whatever is never really going to work for them, because for them, ethnicity is not really so important, not really as important as tribe or family. And it's not a very strong force the way it is in Europe. Secondly, there are advantages to having a state, and I was kind of hoping someone else would bring it up, but security on just for traveling or for maintaining one's business, not having to worry about theft, and as an ultimate last recourse, as a last recourse for dispute resolution. It's a last recourse. But just having a secure state that can also secure benefits from foreign powers. The UN isn't going to go to a warlord for benefits. They're going to go to the Afghan government.
I think
so. It's a funnel for resources.
That's easy to see from our perspective, because we live in a society where the state does provide functioning roads and, well, reasonably functioning police departments and so on. In Afghanistan, that has never been a thing. Like, I'm not sure that I think somebody in Kabul would totally agree with you, right? But I'm not convinced that somebody in 70 miles outside Kandahar is really gonna feel like the state does that. The state is just another bully who underpays its police department. So the police department arrests you, forces you to pay a bribe to get out, right? I think the reason that a centralized state doesn't extend much outside cities is because there isn't that trust. Like Noah said, like the trust doesn't exist.
Owen, what do you think? Do you think are you in Mac's camp? Do you think that the state is just never going to break in to rural areas without violating their trust?
Without violating their trust, possibly. I don't know really. I'd have said that in the case of a country like Afghanistan, even its rural areas are very different from one another. For example, rural Helmand is very different to rural parts of say northern Afghanistan, and the problems they face are different. I think particularly logistically.
That is a good point. especially the fact that instability is very inconsistent across the Afghan geography, right? Like places where state intervention would be really necessary is not always, they're in certain areas in like the south and the east, especially.
I think the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan lacked the institutions required to build trust with people in rural areas. The lack of a functioning police force, the lack of non-corrupt justice systems, underfunded schools, etc. Lack of infrastructure investment in rural areas. So I don't really think they had the tools, so to speak, to build trust with those people. I do think it is possible for a government to do it, but I don't really see how that government would currently exist.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with you, and I think that the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan was a horrible failure for a number of reasons, including the kind of patron-client relations that Karzai fostered early on were really detrimental. But that's another matter. I guess here's another way of asking it: what could rural Afghans ask of the state? But one of the things that could ask for them that we can all agree on is stay away, to some extent, stay away.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's all. I mean, I think that Afghans like having access to hospitals. It's hard to be against hospitals. If you don't trust the government, you might not go to the hospital. If you have a bad road, you might not want to go there because it's dangerous, or you'll get extorted, or it's too far. But there are things that rural Afghans can ask of a state, right? Well, what could those be? I don't know. Maybe I'm framing the argument too narrowly. Maybe there is something they can ask.
I don't. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I think maybe where I take issue with your argument is that like it almost feels kind of colonial to be like, a state is not only necessary, but it's fundamentally good, and rural Afghanis need a state, is kind of like what I'm taking issue with. Like, do they want a state? Do they want to have that kind of power relationship? I'm not convinced they do.
At the very least, I would agree that they don't want to. It seems pretty clear now that that state collapsed that they really didn't like the idea of a state which was backed by outsiders.
Right? That much is very, yeah.
That if maybe, it's sort of absurd to think, because of course we've already criticized the Bush administration and the coalition for not having come in with a plan, right? But we kept staying, right? I'm almost curious if we had set things up effectively, set up aid more effectively, and then pulled out earlier, like, would it have collapsed as quickly or as like before the Taliban had really built back up, right? I have to at least be curious as to what would have happened, because the state never. I don't think the state ever felt legitimate, because I do somewhat side with Armand that like it's hard to imagine that they didn't want better roads and hospitals and so on.
Yeah,
but those roads and hospitals never came, right? Because of the corruption.
Certainly not in rural areas, right. Anyway.
Exactly, and so without that, there's no trust, and I think maybe the difference between Noah's point and where I am is I don't think the trust was there, and I don't think it was built. It's Noah. Do you think it was impossible for a state to build trust?
That's a bit too extreme, but in essence, yes.
But the state takes a certain has to take a certain imperial attitude, which would have either been oppressive in order to be effective, and that wouldn't have worked.
Yeah, like at least the way that thing, like the way that powers are currently aligned in Afghanistan, I don't think there was ever a way for a trustworthy state to form. I'm not necessarily saying that there can't be an Afghani state, but I don't think that anything is aligned in a way that would help that right now.
One thing I think we talked about a little bit last episode, was how in the globalized world, it's sort of impossible for a country to kind of develop on its own, right? Like there's always so many foreign actors who are going to be influencing, right? Whether that's Saudi Wahhabi clerics influencing the Taliban, or the United States, or Pakistan influencing the Taliban, or the United States trying to create a liberal regime, they can't kind of develop these institutions on their own. They're not going to be allowed to. Do you think that that has created a part of the impediment to creating a trustworthy state?
You mean like the proverbial dictatorship of the NGOs?
Yeah,
like,
but
not even
even
that. Like if, let's say, things really radically changed and Afghanistan tried to create a homegrown state, like would they be able to sustain whatever they make? Because if something's different, it's going to be a threat to, or perceived as a threat to other nations, right?
Right. I mean, Pakistan in particular, right? We can't talk about a strong Afghan state really without thinking about Afghanistan without thinking about Pakistan, because Pakistan really doesn't want a very strong Afghan state. And, the Taliban right now have, I guess we could call it an opportunity, which they don't seem to be using particularly effectively, to create a state. They don't, directly administer the entire country, but they are, at this point, the closest thing to a hegemonic power within Afghanistan. So you can create a state out of some sort of federated state or something out of a hegemonic power. I don't know if the Taliban are really interested in doing it.
They certainly failed to do that when they were in power the first time.
Yeah, they didn't have that long. But
I think that some of the biggest differences that we see between 2001 and now is, I mean, they seem to be trying to at least look like a state. I think they care more about legitimacy first, and then state building is a secondary thing for them right now. They clearly don't want to relearn the ugly lessons that they did at seizing power and then in 1999, in the 90s. They're not going into direct acts of genocide against the Hazara, though they will permit indirect ones. But in terms of whether or not the Afghans have built their own state, I think they certainly can. And one of the biggest failures of the state-building effort by coalition forces in the Islamic Republic was the fact that infrastructure projects were being done by foreigners, for example.
Right.
And
whether that's
people,
Europeans, Americans, Turks, whoever.
Yeah. People wouldn't consult the Afghanistans about what they wanted and where, because there was and often still is this wisdom about foreign aid in the West that if you're sending someone foreign aid, or if you're bringing NGOs to the country, trying to rebuild them from some disaster, from a failed state or whatever, they have lost the ability to govern, which is not true, right? There's this idea that, they can't govern themselves. They need a foreign way of doing things. They need an outside helper to come and save themselves, right? To come and save them.
Well, we're kind of putting them in this trap of we're trying to build this liberal democracy, right? Which needs an educated workforce to make it run smoothly. But then we're not actively investing enough in educating the local workforce. And so at least the way it was built, we just built this little dependency that, of course, it collapsed the moment we pulled out.
Yeah, and that's the thing. They were floating on U.S. aid. The government, could not raise taxes effectively. Right. That's what, one, very Western way of looking at state building is, can you raise taxes? Right. And the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, functioned as it could because it had so much American money and money from elsewhere. Without that money, they would have... Go ahead.
For a century, relying on foreign aid.
Yeah, but that doesn't... But I think the scale here is... I agree, but the U.S. was, doubling or more the budget of Afghanistan?
Oh, yeah.
It was...
The U.S. contribution was
an absurd amount of money. It was more. We were putting more money into Afghanistan than the Afghan GDP was. Right. That is, at least in part, I think it's pretty clear that leads to just corruption. Right. Because it's not like we didn't. It's not like the West didn't try to educate people in Afghanistan. They did set up a lot of places, but they could only effectively be looked after in the cities. And there's this question of that we're trying to deal with, which is in the majority of the population's rural. And frequently a lot of power comes from the rural communities, right? Which is how which is where the Taliban gained its strength. There's a disconnect, and I think what Noah, maybe part of what you're trying to say is that this disconnect is inherent in the culture of those regions.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Like
the process of education, it would take major cultural. We were trying to change their culture, right? Like I don't think anybody in the West would sort of pretend to not say that, to not be saying that. I mean, if they are, then they're really full of themselves. But so I don't want to
as
talk too much
interesting
about that here.
as interesting and important as the question of a modern Afghan state is, we are running low on time, and I think it's time for us to move on to the next and final question of the hour, which is, what is the future of Pashtunwali under the Taliban today? Is Pashtunwali going to continue to undermine the Taliban regime the way it did leading up to 2001? Or, as many analysts have suggested, is Pashtunwali itself no longer really tenable in Afghanistan today?
I think it's going to continue to undermine the Taliban's effort, or even more like is the Taliban actually trying to go into rural Afghanistan and change Pashtunwali in a direct way, or is it just going to be this like rural, thorn in the side of the Taliban regime?
I mean, I think there's definitely elements of the Pashtunwali that the Taliban don't like, right? Like the Chirgas, right?
Yeah, the Jurgen.
Yeah.
They don't like those because that's one. I mean, that isn't a system that finds its basis in Sharia, let's say, right?
It allegedly impugns against Sharia law.
Right.
There.
And the Taliban clearly have a lot of social issues they care about. And some of those align with Pashtunwali, and some of them don't. So, but I think, Noah, I think you're mostly right that so long as they're getting some cooperation, I think the Taliban is going to focus on where it can make the most change, which, much like the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, is going to be in the cities, right? It's going to be, policing things like entertainment, which, Taliban don't much like TV or any form of secular entertainment inside the cities.
And that notion is very when the Taliban came to power, one that was very new to Afghanistan.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
Shared by many Afghans.
Yeah.
Most Afghans.
And I'd be curious. I mean, I don't know. It's entirely possible that one of the things about Pashtunwali is, or Pashtunwali as an influence in organizing structure within a society, is it doesn't seem to me like it's a structure that is capable of projecting a lot of power, right? It's very effective at ensuring local autonomy, but it's not a force that's going to unify Afghanistan, in part because they're not all Pashtuns, right? So while they're
Afghanistan is not all Pashtun,
right? So I don't know that the Taliban may figure out, for better or for worse, a way to sort of make a lighter touch state that slowly starts to function, or they may just pillage Afghanistan for themselves, which is kind of what it looks like they're doing. Just kind of setting up self-enrichment through state force.
I think that, one thing that Thomas Barfield said is kind of my Chairman Mao, I have his quotations in my breast pocket at all times when I talk about Afghanistan. One thing that Thomas Barfield said when he wrote about the Taliban and his history of Afghanistan is that the Taliban were never able to effectively make a transition in 2001, in the lead up to 2001, from a movement to a state. They've always had the characteristics of a social movement. They never really developed institutions. They go around and they enforce ideals, a kind of shoddy interpretation of Sharia, but they never really set up institutions. And in some ways, during the Islamic Republic period, during the insurgency, part of their appeal is that they weren't able to be corrupt because they don't have institutions, right?
That's one way to look at it.
Yeah, and that's why they eventually became so popular, because you're not going to join the local militia that is raiding your farmland. You're going to join the people that
Well, you might
fight them.
I mean,
Clearly something did, but not enough.
right. Definitely, there are definitely local strongmen who have pretty effective controls over their areas. That
Yeah,
you know,
but
everybody does join the militia because that's what's keeping the Taliban out or other groups.
To my recollection, something like over 70 or 80% in one of our sources we heard today, something like over 70 to 80% of all crime, of reported crime in rural Afghanistan came from militias, non-Taliban militias that were allegedly friendly with the government, right? One of the things that the Karzai regime did was cut deals of patronage and support with local militiamen. And that meant that, okay, we'll let you do whatever you want as long as you keep control for me. And that results in a lot of corruption. And that's the kind of model. I mean, working with regional authorities is never bad, but having that kind of strongman patronage network, it's more similar to a mafia than a state. And it's one of the reasons why a lot of people grew to detest those militias and often supported the Taliban, because the militias won't affect justice for you, but the Taliban will. It'll be rough, but it'll be some kind of justice. And that's one thing that the Taliban always had a characteristic of, always had an air of being something more like a movement than a body of institutions. And I think even when they were in power, they were too strict to be really corrupt. But we'll see how much they enrich themselves using the apparatuses of the state.
They're pretty corrupt right now, right? I mean, they're not like self-enforcing, right? There are many leaders of the Taliban who are having their daughters educated. So I don't know if I really agree that it may be that the people on the ground didn't see the Taliban as corrupt in ways that they recognize as corruption, because of course corruption is seen differently across different cultures. But I think one thing we can probably all agree on is that whether it's the Western Coalition or the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, they weren't effectively interested in extending state institutions into rural areas. And most of the efforts that did take place were led astray by what you've talked about, the patronage system.
And that's one tally against stepping back early on, right? The question you were talking about earlier, Max, like what happened if the U.S. did intensive long-term state building projects early on and then stepped away. Karzai's strategy going in was really bad. And it's not like Karzai was a U.S. puppet. I mean, he was elected by a lot of people chosen by the U.S., right? After the Bonn Accords.
And he was reelected.
Yeah, and he was reelected. And extremely dubious.
Yeah, well...
actually, those re-elections were actually as pyrrhic as it can get. It actually really convinced a lot of Afghans that the democracy was a sham. But nonetheless, I mean, here's the thing. The U.S. was skewing the presidency in a different direction, in a non-Pashtun direction. Hamid Karzai came from an old, powerful political dynasty in Durrani, Afghanistan. The Durranis, of course, being one branch of the Pashtuns. And they skewed the Bonn Accords, to favor a non-Pashtun leader, because they were worried about the Taliban coming back through a Pashtun leader, right? And nonetheless, all the people there chose Karzai as the provisional president, right? Because they realized that Afghanistan was best led by a Pashtun for political reasons. But to get back to the question of the Taliban, I think that it's hard to tell now how long things will last. But if the Taliban continues to be the kind of institution it is and doesn't transform and change gears and undergo some serious internal reform, Afghanistan is not going to be Afghanistan anymore. In other words, we won't have the same values. We won't see the same values on local autonomy in rural areas if the Taliban continues to force and push its interpretation of Sharia jurisprudence on rural areas. Either that, or we will start to see a refracturing of Afghanistan. And that being said, of course, Pashtunwali is not the only mode of dispute resolution and moral and social law out there in Afghanistan. Other ethnic groups have similar concepts, like Baluchiyat, for example, for the Baloch people. But Pashtunwali is universally understood to be the most important one here, right?
Certainly the US military felt that way, because they were fighting against primarily.
Yes, exactly. I mean,
Taliban.
the Taliban is a primarily Pashtun-based insurgency, yeah. So to wrap things up for today, I think we should address the following question. Is Pashtunwali antithetical to state building in Afghanistan or not?
Yes.
Why?
This is going to sound stupid and tautological, but it's antithetical to state building because it's antithetical to the state.
Okay.
Because I guess my point would be, what I would say is, I sort of agree that Pashtunwali is a system that has been developed in the absence of a state, and therefore does not conform with state elements. But I do think that it's not any effort towards any future efforts towards making a state in Afghanistan is going to have to deal with it, whether by destroying it or incorporating it.
Owen?
No, I think it can be incorporated into the state. I do think it's not inherently, by its nature, pro-state. I think it's worth bearing in mind, like most cultural ideas, it's also not a fixed thing itself. I'm sure Pashtunwali has changed slightly over time, and I'm sure in some way it could change to suit the state if necessary, or the state can change to suit Pashtunwali. I'm not really sure if there's any concept particularly that a state hasn't been able to incorporate into itself other than maybe anarchism.
Well, as for myself, I think that Pashtunwali is not antithetical to state building as such. It is something that has emerged from the need to resolve disputes in the absence of the state, naturally. But that doesn't mean that the state and the potential resources it can provide to rural Afghans can't be available. I think that in Afghanistan, the state is something that, in theory, Afghans should be able to go to for help, but should not necessarily expect to come to them to get into their affairs themselves. I think you can have both. And I think that the state in Afghanistan doesn't have to have absolute sovereignty over every scrap of territory or every legal matter in the country.
Before you go, we want to say thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to check back soon for more. You can continue listening to us where you found this one. We welcome listener feedback, which you can send to us at our email at unendinghistorypodcast@gmail.com. See you next time.